in there at the deepest level. And that's is an important fact to note, that this was an attack on human consciousness. It shut down people's ability to think.
Expand on that, an attack on human consciousness.
Well, let me continue on. So I went into campus, and first person I ran into was my graduate student, who said, Dr. Wood, what's Al Qaeda? Who's bin Laden? This is before noon. And like, this blew me away. And then I ran into a couple of faculty members who mentally had a pitchfork in hand, and they're ready to go get the bad guy. We got to take him out. We got to take them all out. And it was, they were programmed to be in revenge mode, not to stop and see what had happened, but you got to go get somebody.
I was startled in the preface to your book. Even, I mean, every page has such terrific information,
and then I watched the buildings. I went to the faculty conference room, saw the buildings turning into dust in midair, and at this point I was thinking this was a War of the Worlds on TV, and I kind of looked. I didn't say anything, but I had this look on my face, pointed at the TV, like, you guys aren't buying this, are you? I mean, these are mechanical engineering professors, and they couldn't be hoodwinked into buying that. That's not a collapse.
I mentioned the Warren Report, which was a fraud, but I was startled even in the preface of your book when you said that NIST, N-I-S-T, and you'll have to tell us what those initials
National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Okay, they were supposed to have conducted the investigation, and you say in your book that they admit that their investigation was a fraud. This is in the preface. Mm-hmm.
Yes, they were mandated by Congress to determine why and how the buildings, quote, collapsed, unquote. And the first thing when I submitted my request for corrections to them was, you got to change the title of this, because the title was something like The Final Report on the Collapse of. And then I said, well, this diagram you have, this building, the tipping top of Tower 2, it violates the conservation of angular momentum, violates the laws of physics. So your analysis, and then they said, oh no, it doesn't, our analysis doesn't violate the laws of physics because we didn't have an analysis. We didn't study what happened to the building. We just generated a hypothetical scenario.
Well, you quote a Dr. Reynolds in that preface who points that out. Tell me who Dr. Reynolds is, what he said, and why it wasn't information more widely disseminated.
Dr. Morgan Reynolds, I eventually became acquainted with, was, obsessed about the airplanes. And fine, I know that the buildings most of the buildings turn into powder in midair, and airplanes don't do that. Real airplanes don't, and neither do fake airplanes. And the airplanes were a distraction. I called them the getaway car. It distracts people from what the main event was. But Dr. Morgan Reynolds was really hung up on the plane story. Okay. And what he, discovered is they just assumed there were airplanes. There was no evidence in the report of any airplanes. And so we kept our things separate. But still, when I submitted my Ketam case, that's a whistleblower case, they combined the two, and then the judge denigrated mine because of the airplane assumption. Well, mine had nothing to do with airplanes.
Well, there were numerous eyewitnesses on the street just shortly after it happened who said they didn't see airplanes that looked like airplanes. Some said they had no windows. Some said they looked like rockets. And you have another sort of interesting comic book analogy in there about this Roadrunner effect. Expand on that.
It's a cartoon I used to show my students when I teach them about shear stress, where Wile E. Coyote holds out a big Acme steel plate, and his Roadrunner's flying down the road, and then whoosh, something goes by, and he goes, what was that? And he looks at the steel plate, and it's a silhouette of passage of a Roadrunner. A Roadrunner must have gone through here.
That's right.
And the same thing, was with the towers. You have this silhouette of passage of what looks like an airplane hole, must have been an airplane that hit the building.
But to this day, there are many people I know who have genius IQs, I hate to say it, who say, well, I saw the airplanes hit. But did they see airplanes hit?
Okay, here's where I want to break off into another a sub-discussion for a few minutes. Uh,
Certainly.
you know how you cover up irrefutable evidence?
Well, I've never had to, so I don't know.
Well, the easiest way to cover up irrefutable evidence is to refer to it as a theory, or speculation, or ideas, or view. And then throw in lots of other kinds of speculation stirred around. Pretty soon nobody knows up from down. Or you associate it with something else, the person telling it. But there's this other thing that I spelled out in the preface of my book. It's important to first determine what happened, and only then can you determine how it happened. If you don't know what it was, how can you determine how it happened? And only then can you go after who and why. But, as you pointed out, before noon on 9/11, we were told who and why. Bin Laden, they hate us for our freedoms. Okay, but what was it that was done?
Is part of the it what you call the billiards ball of
No,
effect?
no. But the point here is that we first need to determine what happened before you can say how it happened or who did it. You have to determine what it is that happened.
Okay,
And
Doctor,
if you want to get cover up the facts, you get people to skip that first step. You get them to argue about how it happened or
Oh,
who
I
did
see.
it.
I
And
see.
then what they do is assume what happened. And so they're then solving an imaginary problem and not a real problem.
Okay, then
And
what
you can
did?
never ever solve the real problem until you look at what happened, at the
Okay,
evidence. So
what
the key to the
happened?
cover up is keep
Okay,
from
now
looking at the
okay,
evidence.
hang on just a second. Okay, you have seen this, and almost immediately you know something is wrong. When did you begin your absolute serious research? How long did it take you to do that research and to write the book? What was the reaction at the university at which you were teaching
Well,
and, and some of your
yeah,
associates?
I started that day because there was a disconnect. Am I insane or is the rest of the world insane? To ask that question does not imply one's insanity. It's the opposite. What objective way can I use to determine what's going on here? Why are these people these people who should know better? They're sucked into thinking that a building turning to dust is a building collapsing, and we got to go get some, character that they named Bin Laden or whatever. So I went up to my office and made some calculations. Approximately how long it would take a billiard ball to fall off the roof of a building and have it hit the ground, and then if you had one floor fall and another floor and another floor. And I did these calculations. Well, gee, it takes a long time. Maybe it's like a minute and a half floor by floor, and 30 seconds if it's 10 floors by 10 floors. With the assumptions I made. And so I'm thinking maybe I have the coefficient of gravity wrong. I'm looking for every excuse in the book. So I get a physics book off my bookshelf and check the coefficient of gravity. Well, that's the same number I have. Oh, but maybe that was a typo and I memorized a typo. So I get another book and no, that's not going to solve it. They're all the same number. Okay. So I go through these calculations and I do it with the analogy of a billiard ball. And I show it to a colleague. And they look at me like I'm having a senior moment because it's such simple equations. And oh yeah, that's completely correct. And then I show them applied to the towers, and then the numbers are all wrong.
Oh
In other
my.
words, it shuts off their brain. So that's where I learned the power of the billiard ball analogy, or the billiard ball example. It gets the brain moving
One of the
without
one of
the
the
emotional barrier.
well, I've always been under the impression, quite honestly, Dr. Wood, that people do not think, they just feel, and they just use their minds to justify their emotional makeup or their prejudice. But one of the most difficult chapters, of course, to look at is chapter 3, entitled the jumpers. Was there something about the jumpers that reinforced in you the thought of what did happen?
Well, it wasn't reinforcing what did happen. I looked, and I strongly believe in this, to look at the evidence until you know what happened. You don't jump to conclusions, and that actually is a big key here. It's very easy to make assumptions and to jump to conclusions. It takes great discipline to see only what is actually there and experience it to understand what that means. So we have all these people that believe they're experts because they have an opinion and an internet connection, but they don't have the experience to understand it. So being able to, and also the discipline to only see what is there. And so, in a way, people were very brainwashed also. And that's why the chapters are in the order that they're in, because I first had to undo the brainwashing to get people to see what's happening.
That was a stroke of genius in doing that, quite honestly.
And the billiard ball example gets the brain working, and you see the official story doesn't work. That takes care of that. But then following that up with a jumper chapter, it isn't what you assumed it was either. That's the effect of that. You look at it, and there's actually how this came about. A bunch of us were looking up, through the first responder testimony to see how many people identified airplane parts, and we divvied out the different groups of things. And I was going through mine. I got distracted by the first responders stepping over body parts. Ooh. And I asked the others if their people saw body parts, and they didn't see it. They too had stepped around the body parts, reading it. It was, people had to tune it out because it was so unpleasant. So I started looking at it more carefully and realizing these aren't jumpers. There's something else going on here. Like for example, you hit a deer going 80 miles an hour. The deer is almost surely dead, but the parts are basically in one place. It's all busted up. But you don't find a toe there, an ear down there, a tooth there, a rib over here. But what happened to the quote jumpers, what's referred to as the jumpers, is that they came apart to that level.
Oh my! How could bodies come apart?
Well, just take in the data instead of working on how it could have happened. Just think of the data itself and just collect that. And you keep collecting data. As I say, keep looking at the evidence until you know what happened. If you don't know what happened, keep looking at the evidence until you do, because the evidence will tell you what happened.
There was one prominent picture of a man in an orange suit that seemed to be flapping his arms like he was flying. What did that reveal to you as a scientist?
There's a lot of them that did that. If you are jumping out the window and have decided you're going to die, and you're going out the window, you're not flapping your wings. That reminds me of someone who went, whoa, how'd I get here? Like they accidentally ended up out there.
Oh my. And then the story of Jack Gentle talking about his wife.
Right, that she was they're starting down the stairs. She had her head wrapped in a towel that was saturated with water. And she was going to call him on her cell phone when she got to the bottom, she and a friend. And a couple of stories later, she went out the window.
Well,
no intention of going out the window.
Why do you feel she had no intention of going out the window? Is that something?
Well, from what she said to her husband, I'll call you when I get to the bottom.
Oh, I see. Well, if she went out of there unintentionally, could it have been because there was an explosion next to her on the floor, or something else at work?
There's a lot of people seem to just go out the windows, and instead of jump to conclusions, just take that in that there's something weird going on, something unexpected.
Well, a couple of the most telling photographs, and they seem to make such. There's some so the common sense of it is so obvious when it's explained and shown by you. And I'd seen some of those pictures 100 times and never thought about it.